It's time for another episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show, a podcast where I connect you with thought leaders from across the globe, digging into some of my favorite topics like personal development, marketing, spirituality, and pretty much any other shiny object that happens to catch my attention. Today, my special guest is Carmen Joy Imes, and we're going to be discussing her new book, Bearing God's Name, Why Sinai Still Matters. Carmen, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Well, let's kick off our conversation today with a bit of what we might call the Carmen Joy Imes origin story. So talk to us about your academic background. Where did you study and what's your role at Prairie College in Three Hills, Alberta?
All right. Yeah, I did my undergraduate work at Multnomah Bible College, now Multnomah University, studying Bible and theology with a minor in Greek. My husband and I became missionaries after that for a while, and when we came back from overseas, I started in on a master's degree in biblical studies from Gordon Conwell. They have a campus in Charlotte that allowed me to study on evenings and weekends so I could have the kids during the day. So it was a great flexible place to study. And during my time at Gordon Conwell, I realized I'm not done yet. I want to learn more. So I started applying to doctoral programs and dove into the program at Wheaton College under Dr. Daniel Block, and finished that in 2016. So I've been at Prairie College this is my third year, and I am professor of Old Testament, and I also oversee or coordinate our Bible theology majors here.
And in terms of specialization, is there any particular topic area that you focus on the most or often?
Yeah, I would say my two areas of greatest interest are Exodus and Psalms. I did my doctoral work in the Ten Commandments, so I've spent a lot of time at Sinai, hence the book, but I'm also working on some projects in the Psalms too.
And you had mentioned that you did some missionary work. Where did you get to serve?
We were in the Philippines for 2.5 years.
All right. Well, thanks for giving us a little rundown of your past and helping us get to know you a bit better. Next, let's get into the story behind the book. As a guy who works in the publishing space, I'm always curious how a project gets its start. So what exactly sets you down the path of writing this book?
Yeah, this is a book that I had been wanting to write for many years, all the way through my doctoral studies. I kept feeling like, wow, this is really cool stuff and the church needs to hear it. But I knew that nobody was going to be reading my dissertation, at least not the church at large. You know, a handful of scholars read it. And so as soon as my dissertation came out in print, I began work on a proposal for this book, wanting to translate all the stuff I'd learned for lay people and make it more accessible. So I had a good dialogue with InterVarsity Press about it. We went back and forth with a couple different drafts of an outline for the book. And as soon as we locked on the right sort of structure or the right hook, I was off like a shot and wrote the book in one summer. It was really fun.
Well, and as a guy who worked in the academic space for a while at Fortress Press, I can vouch for that. This volume from InterVarsity Press is a lot cheaper than the average published dissertation volume.
It is. It's only a fraction of the cost of my dissertation, and it's already sold multiple times more. I think there are 200 copies of my dissertation out there somewhere, and we're well over 1,700 copies of this book that are being read. So.
Well, and even as dissertations go, selling 200 copies, that's actually really impressive. Some sell less than 50 or maybe less than 25, depending on the topic.
Yeah, I'm really pleased. I think that this book with IVP is actually helping dissertation sales because people are reading the book and saying, oh, wow, this is great stuff. I want to see all of her homework that led her to these conclusions. And so they're going and finding the dissertation.
Yes, they want the book behind the book.
There is a book behind the book.
One of the things you talk about is that, we as Christians need the Old Testament today, and that really it's time for us to rehitch ourselves to Israel's scriptures so that we can better understand who Jesus is and what he came to do. Why do you think the church has kind of lost touch with the Old Testament? I think for a lot of us, it's just not a place where maybe during that first part of the year when people buckle down and start I'm going to read the Bible in a year sort of a thing. It's January, people are doing that. But for the most part, I don't see a lot of people spending time in the Old Testament. Why are we avoiding it?
Yeah, well, I think February is when the bottom drops out because we get to Leviticus. or the latter part of Exodus, and we say, what is all this stuff? It doesn't seem very relevant. Some of it actually seems objectionable. It doesn't seem like it values equality or nonviolence. There's a lot of stuff we just don't know what to do with. And so it's a lot easier to just forget about the Old Testament and hang out in the Gospels. But when we do that, we run the risk of actually misunderstanding, misinterpreting the New Testament, because we don't understand the world that it's coming out of.
Well, and one of the things I think people are going to really appreciate about your book is you just bring out so many interesting facts and kind of little rabbit trails that you take us down where people are going to be, if they're familiar with the stories that you're sharing, or the accounts might be a better way to say it, since we're talking about the Bible, they're going to be surprised at what they've been missing. So for this middle part of the interview, would love to have you just unpack some of the ground that you cover in the book. So first, let's talk about God's name. How does God sharing his personal name with Moses and the Israelites distinguish him from the other little g gods that we see in the surrounding nations? Why was that unique?
Yeah, it's unique. It's unique in several ways. One is that there, in the ancient world, there was this idea that if you know a God's name, then you have some sort of access to his power, his or her power. And so there's this dialogue in Egyptian text that talks about gods trying to figure out each other's real names. They go by pseudonyms so that people don't have access to their real power. And there's this sense of sort of quest for finding a God's real name. And here Yahweh shows up and just makes it available to his people, which is actually putting himself at risk. So this willingness to be known and to be known personally is a big deal. Another aspect of the name that I think might be new to people, I've had several people say, oh, is your book about the names of God? Are you going to go into the names of God? And I want to say, but I don't want to burst their bubble, but what I really want to say is God only has one name. It's Yahweh. There are a lot of titles he's given throughout Scripture, but there's really only one name, and it's the revelation of that name at Sinai that is the big deal that I'm trying to unpack in the book.
Next, let's talk about what we can learn from the Israelites about liminal space. And I know some of the listeners are going, liminal, what in the world does that mean? So define that for us, and then talk to us about, what we can learn, what we can see as Israel is walking through this in-between space at Sinai.
Yeah, liminal is one of my favorite English words that I learned during my doctoral studies, and it's a word that we should all know because it's just really useful in making sense of life. So it comes from the Latin word limen, which is the threshold of a doorway. So if you imagine sort of standing in a doorway, you're neither in nor out of a room, you're in between spaces. And so the word liminal started first to be used by sociologists, anthropologists, to explain stages of life or stages of rituals that we go through where we're in between one place in life and another. So you might think of a pregnant woman as a woman in liminal space. She's carrying a child within her, but she hasn't yet held the child or fed the child or changed the child's diaper. And so she's in this sort of in-between space between not being a mom and being a mom. And so liminal space is rarely comfortable. It's usually very uncomfortable, but it's a place in which we undergo the greatest degree of change. And so in the book, I explore various kinds of liminal spaces that we pass through, but all in conversation with this major liminal space that Israel goes through in the wilderness. So when God meets them at Sinai, he's meeting them precisely in that place where they are the most upended, discombobulated. They've lost the structure that they're used to. So there's all these questions about who's in charge and where are they going to go next and where do they find food, and all of the normal ways of life have been stripped away from them. And it's in that place of sort of loss, even though it's a happy loss, it's a deliverance from slavery, there's still an uncertainty about it. And it's into that space that God speaks and reveals himself and who he is, and also reveals who they are. So Israel becomes who they are in that liminal space.
Next, let's talk about the experience that the Israelites had in Egypt, where they were, complaining about, not always complaining, but, they had want of food, they had want of good water to drink. And one of the things I thought that was interesting that you bring out in the book is in God's responses to Israel, he's kind of countering some of the plagues, some of the things we saw in Egypt. So that they're to some degree longing back for their life in Egypt. And God is saying, no, I'm providing for you right here. And it's in direct contrast to what they saw when they came out of Egypt.
Yeah, the narrator is very clever in telling the story in that as we read about the deliverance, we see that the plagues actually anticipate the deliverance that God is going to give. And so some of the same words are used and are echoing between them. So for example, the water is turned to blood so that they can't drink it in Egypt, but then when they're in the wilderness, they come to Mara and the water's bitter so they can't drink it. But whereas God had judged the Egyptians by making the water undrinkable, here he blesses the Israelites and makes the water fit to drink. And so he's revealing over and over again his intentions to bless them, to provide for them, to accompany them on this journey, to lead them. And yet, again and again, we see them sort of conceiving of their own experience in negative ways. They're whining about the lack of food in the wilderness and wishing they could go back to Egypt, completely missing the fact that God is providing everything they need.
Well, you've already talked to us a bit about one of your favorite English words. So next, let's talk about one of your favorite Hebrew words. I'm not going to say it. I'll probably butcher it. So, but talk to us about that word and how that really helps us to get a sense of Israel's special status with God.
Yeah, my favorite Hebrew word is segala, and we see it first in Exodus chapter 19, which is right when the people arrive at Sinai before they get the 10 Commandments. And Moses goes up to the mountain, and God tells him in verse 4, Exodus 19, verse 4, "You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession." And that phrase treasured possession is translating the Hebrew word segala. It's not God's way of saying, oh, I really like you guys. You're just so cute. It's not sort of his pep talk trying to be encouraging to them. The word segala actually is a technical term used in treaty contexts. And yes, it means God is choosing them, but he's not choosing them so that they can just sit back and relax, but he's choosing them to a vocation. He's giving them a job to do. And at Sinai, they discover that their job is to represent him among the nations. So it goes on in Exodus 19 to say, "Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." So this language that he's using to describe them is actually launching them into a new ministry of representation.
Next, let's talk about the 10 Commandments. I think for many people in broader Western culture, in terms of the 10 Commandments being written on stone, we have Hollywood visions in our head of Charlton Heston up on the mountain receiving the 10 Commandments from God.
Yeah.
But a lot of yes, but a lot of people don't really think beyond that point. And one of the things I think you draw out interestingly in the book is a lot of people think they're written on 2 tablets because they just simply couldn't fit on a single tablet. But we have 2 tablets for a very, very different reason. So talk to us about that. Why were the 10 Commandments given on 2 tablets, and what's significant about that?
Yeah, so this requires a little bit of digging into ancient Near Eastern culture, and actually archaeology has helped us out with this, because what archaeologists will tell us is that treaties were written in duplicate copy on 2 stone tablets so that each party could keep a copy. So Moses has already been up on the mountain, and God has used a treaty term to describe the people. He's called them his segala. Then Moses comes down from the mountain later with 2 tablets, and that would have been an automatic signal to everybody watching, oh, we've just entered into a treaty, because when you enter into a treaty, you get 2 tablets. So right, it's not as though the 10 Commandments did not all fit on one. we're told that there were 2 tablets and that they were inscribed on front and back. And you could have a tablet just a little bigger than your hand and fit all the 10 commandments on them front and back. You don't need 2 tablets for that. 2 tablets, so the scriptures don't say this explicitly that they're duplicate, but when we're reading this in its ancient Near Eastern context, it seems most likely that these are duplicate copies, and it indicates that God is entering into a covenant with Israel. He's calling them his treasured possession, and then he's laying out for them, here's what it's going to look like for you to be my treasured possession. Here's how I need for you to live so that you can represent me well.
And in terms of that ancient Near Eastern context, if I remember correctly, each party would have put their respective tablet in the temple of their god, per se. So in terms of Israel's experience, I think one copy ends up in the Ark of the Covenant. And I'm kind of curious, where would Moses have put the other copy?
Yeah, we're told that both tablets are put in the Ark of the Covenant. Okay. So this is a little bit different in Israel's case because we don't have 2 different nations making a treaty with each other where they each have their own temple where they can keep the duplicate copies. Instead, they have just one tabernacle with one holy place. And so both tablets going there, I wrestled with this for a while. What could this mean? Why have duplicate copies if they're both going in the same place? I think it's a way of signaling, that they're entering into a formal treaty. So the 2 tablets signify that. But then the fact that both copies are put in the Ark of the Covenant, I think signifies that Yahweh is going to hold them accountable for their end of the covenant, but he's going to hold himself accountable for his end of the covenant. There's no higher power that can hold him accountable. And normally it's the God of each nation is holding the people who are entering into the treaty accountable. So it's God's holding people accountable. This covenant's different because it's a God making a treaty with people. And so he's holding himself accountable.
One of the commandments that you spend quite a bit of time talking about in the book is the commandment about not taking God's name in vain. And you really ask us to take a left turn and think about this in an entirely different way than most of us have been brought up to view that commandment. So maybe give us the background of how you reached the conclusions you reached. And once we start thinking about in this new direction, where should that take us?
Yeah, so this is the command that I spent my whole time at Wheaton studying for my doctorate. So I spent 5 years on this command and wrote a 300-page dissertation just on this verse. So I do have a strong opinion about it. But it wasn't my idea to begin with. It was Dan Block's idea that this command needed a fuller investigation. And he had already published an article suggesting that we've been reading it wrong. So I began my own study with a full survey of as many interpretations as I could find of this command throughout history. And I identified 23 different ways that this command is interpreted. But most of us think of it as a command not to use God's name as a swear word or like a cuss word. So you're driving down the freeway and somebody cuts you off and you say, and you let the divine name slip out. That's what the command is prohibiting. And after studying it for all this time, I'm convinced that's not what's going on. The command in Hebrew reads sort of ambiguously, or it maybe seems strange to translators, and that's why they've said, for example, in the NIV, you shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God, or you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, is how we've heard it. But in Hebrew, it says, you shall not lift up or carry the name of Yahweh your God in vain. And so, of course, translators come to this and say, well, we don't carry God's name, so this must mean something else. And so then they go hunting to try to find how is this like a figurative expression, or how can we make sense of it? And they look for parallel passages. But I think actually the key to interpreting this command properly is right in the context at Sinai. Just a few chapters later, we have the high priestly garments described. They're building the tabernacle. They're getting instructions for how to build the tabernacle and then how to clothe the priests who are going to serve in the tabernacle. And it says that the high priest is supposed to wear this breast piece with 12 precious stones on it. And the stones are to be engraved like the engraving of a signet ring. So that would be like a name engraved on them. And then it says, and so Aaron shall bear the names of the sons of Israel before Yahweh. And so there's that same phrase from the name command, bear the names. And I think that this is the key to how we're supposed to read the command, that the command is implying that Yahweh has put his name on the people of Israel as a way of claiming them as his own. They belong to him. He owns them. And so now they're to go out and live their life in such a way that they carry that name in a way that honors him. So they're not supposed to carry that name in vain. So it's kind of like wearing a tattoo. We can kind of imagine that we're tattooed with God's name and that we are then his representatives. This fits together with the idea of segula, or being God's treasured possession. If that means to represent him, it's natural to envision that as him claiming them by putting his name on them.
Well, as I was listening to this part of the book, the one thing that kept ringing in my mind is, oh, Jesus is the ultimate embodiment of this. So talk to us a little bit about that. Like, how does this better help us to understand Jesus' time and what that means for us as Christians today?
Yeah, this is one of the really fun parts about my dissertation work. Was I read through the entire Bible kind of looking for this theme, looking at the idea of bearing God's name, because it was a new concept to me, especially I had never seen it before in this command. And I wondered if I could find that evidence of that anywhere else. And in fact, it's everywhere. In almost every book of the Bible, there's references to the people who bear his name. And when we get to the New Testament, that persists. So Jesus, when he's teaching his disciples to pray, he says, hallowed be thy name, or may your name be sanctified. I used to think that was just his way of saying, wow, God, your name is holy. But after doing this study, I now think that Jesus is actually committing himself to be a name bearer who bears God's name with honor. That when he says, hallowed be your name, he actually sees himself as the answer to that prayer. Israel had borne the name in a way that brought God's reputation into disrepute. Like they went into exile because of their disobedience, and all the nations are saying, oh, Yahweh must not be very powerful because look, his people have had to leave their land. I'm getting that from Ezekiel 36, but you can see it all through the prophets. The nations are getting the wrong impression about God because of Israel's behavior. Jesus comes along and says, no, we need to commit ourselves to honoring God's name by living in a way that's faithful. We're going to be faithful to the covenant.
Another part of the book that was kind of interesting to me, you talked a bit about some experiences you've had in terms of, should we have representations of Christ, images, and like I'm a guy who grew up in the Lutheran church, so I grew up in a space where we had icons and stained glass and the whole thing. And now I'm in more of an evangelical context where it's pretty white and boring in the sanctuary. Should we be concerned about having graven images? Like, what's your take on that?
Yeah, so that is an age-old question, and I think it actually we can trace the answer to that question back to how the commands are counted at Sinai. So we know there's 10 commandments. The Bible tells us there were 10, but actually how to count them is quite disputed. And so if we go back to the 10 commandments and ask ourselves, is having no other gods the same thing as not making images? Are those one and the same command? Or are these two different commands? The denominations or traditions that count them as two separate commands tend to be the ones with bare walls in church. The ones that count them as the same command freely use images of Jesus because we're not being commanded not to make images of Yahweh. We're being commanded not to worship other gods by making images of them. So the way you count that actually works its way out in your church practice. I personally have never had a problem with depictions of Jesus. Well, I do have a problem with lots of depictions of Jesus because they make him white and give him blue eyes, and that's really historically inaccurate. But actually making a picture of Jesus isn't a problem to me because he took on flesh and became incarnate. And the rationale given for not making images is you didn't see any form on the mountain. Well, now we've seen a form. We've seen the form of Jesus. And so I don't think it's a problem to have pictures of him.
Any other commandments you want to point us to that were particularly surprising for you, or you feel like that maybe in terms of when people read the book, they're going to be like, oh my gosh, wow, I never saw this one coming?
Yeah, I think maybe the Sabbath command was a surprise for me as I studied, because I always thought of that as the command that we don't have to keep anymore because of Jesus. Like, we don't have to keep the Sabbath. And as I studied it, I began to see what a gift the Sabbath is. Here are people who've been enslaved, working for Pharaoh 24/7, working to line Pharaoh's pockets and to build his empire. And God sets them free. And one of the first things he tells them is, take a day off. Don't work like you're a slave anymore. And I think it's really funny that we want to get rid of that command when it's the command to have a day off, and to take a break, to rest, to not work like everything depends on you, but to actually rest in God's provision. He will keep the world turning. We don't have to. And so that was one that especially challenged me.
Well, I can't think of anybody who doesn't need to have that reinforced right now in our always on culture that seems to be going on around us. You share a number of personal stories in the book, and I think one of my favorite stories had to do with French bread. So talk to us about how a woman showing up at your door with French bread helped you to better understand God's provision.
Yeah, Danny and I had just gotten married. We were living in married student housing, and I had never tried to live on a budget before. Like, I was under my parents' roof before that. And so I had this sort of maybe typical anxiety of a newlywed couple over how we're going to make ends meet, and figuring out how much groceries cost, because I'd been eating in the cafeteria for a couple of years and never had to actually buy my food. And so I remember grocery shopping one day, and I would plan to make spaghetti for dinner. And I was looking, trying to plan the menu, and I thought, oh, French bread, like making garlic bread would be so good. Like, and I'm looking at the French bread, and I'm looking at how much it costs, and I think it was like $2 for this loaf of French bread. But in my mind, that was $2, and we were going to consume it all in one meal, whereas I could spend $2 on another loaf of sliced bread, and we could make sandwiches for a week. And so to me, it seemed like it was a misuse of funds to splurge on French bread. Now, that this was 21 years ago, I'm not that uptight about money anymore, and I kind of know how things work. But at the time, it was a real fear that I had. Can we make it on a student income? And I got home. I decided not to buy the bread. And I got home, and I was making dinner, and there was a knock on my door, and it was my next door neighbor. She came to my back sliding door, and I went, and she's like, we've got an extra loaf of bread, and I wondered if you could use it. And she handed me French bread. And it was the most startling thing for me. It was like, how in the world did that just happen? Now, to this day, I don't know if she was at the store at the same time and saw me deliberating and bought the bread because she just knew that I was torn. I don't know. Why did she have how does anyone have an extra loaf of French bread in their house? But she brought it to me, and it was such a tender way of God showing me, I've got this. You can trust me. And I saw it as a very lavish blessing, even though it was probably only worth $2.
Well, when you're in those student housing days, free bread can be a lavish blessing. That seems an appropriate way to describe it. In terms of, say, the reader's journey with this book, when they get to that last page, they close that back flap. If they only take away one thing, what's the one way you want them to be impacted and changed by the book?
Yeah, I really want people to rediscover the value of the Old Testament and to see its relevance. And in particular, I hope that my readers discover that we can't know who we are without Sinai. If we want to know who we are and what we're here to do in the world, we've got to go back to Sinai and understand our relationship with Israel's story. And I hope that people walk away with a greater hunger to go back and read the Bible again for themselves, to read the Old Testament and get through the whole thing and see the riches of God's grace that are there.
And Carmen, for the listeners, the viewers who'd like to connect with you, find out more about you, where can we find you on the web?
Well, I have a blog. You can find me at carmenjoyimes.blogspot.com. You can also find me on my faculty page at Prairie College. And I look forward to hearing from readers. I'm getting messages multiple times a day now as people are finishing the book or partway through the book, and they're reaching out to tell me what it means to them. And that's been really fun. It's been a very communal experience publishing a book. So it's been great.
Well, and like we do with every episode, we'll have detailed links in the show notes, places where you can connect with Carmen and pick up your own copy of the book. It's time to bring this episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show to a close. Many thanks for being a part of my conversation with Carmen Joy Imes. Once again, our book today was Bearing God's Name, Why Sinai Still Matters. For more on Carmen, a great place to start is her blog. You can check that out over at carmenjoyimes.blogspot.com. And we'll have a link to her faculty page in our show notes as well. Carmen, I just want to say thanks so much for sharing with us today. It's been a great pleasure and an honor to have you on the show.
Thanks so much for having me. This has been great.